well, I remember watching Sam Harris. I've watched him a couple of times. So Sam Harris is the CEO of ChatGPT, right? And I remember particularly his interview on Lex Friedman, right? And Lex Friedman has kind of like Elon Musk, like he's had some of these concerns, but he's also very, very intrigued. Like he wants it to work, even though he has
optimistic.
Yeah. And in that dialogue, like Sam Harris was very adamant on, he's obviously the optimist of optimists on it, and he paints a very beautiful picture of things that it could do, but he's very adamant on this is going to, and we're not very far from this, get to the point where, and it needs to by its very design, be completely out of our control, right? So it's going to become kind of this mind that provides information and guidance and all of this kind of stuff. And Sam Harris even wants to give like political control over to this thing. And his whole claim is people are corruptible, but we want to create something that's incorruptible, right? Yeah,
that'll work.
That's going to go well.
Yeah.
But just by he describes it as something that has to take on its own persona and its own decision making. So just that very understanding means you're handing it over and you're saying, here's something that is above us, to use Lewis's language. It sounds a lot like the macrobe, right? That is going to have its own mind, its own decision-making skills. It's going to be its own entity. And what would we use to describe it? Like what Christian vocabulary would we have for creating an entity that is, well, we've created it for one. So we're not receiving this from God. We know that. And we're not even receiving it from a man. We're just receiving it from this new entity. Like what would that category be? And the only other category we have are angels and demons. And that doesn't seem like the formula by which God says, here's how St. Michael is going to communicate with you guys. I want you to create this.
It's not the angels that we're calling down.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's the obvious parallel is the Tower of Babel, right? Tower of Babel, they wanted to build this, man under his own power, using his technology, undertook a tower to heaven to compel God to come down from heaven and serve man and do things for man that man could not do for himself. I think that best way to understand what the AI people are doing is by reference to the Tower of Babel, right? This is sort of a Tower of Babel enterprise. And just because the people, the Sam Harrises who are undertaking this are uncatechized, post-Christian, pagans, neo-pagans, and just because they will not use religious language doesn't mean that we should not understand as Christians, as Westerners, that we should not understand what they're doing is fundamentally religious and very, in my view, very, very dangerous.
Well, I mean, so That Hideous Strength, which we've referenced, that book by C.S. Lewis, that's based off a poem that was written about the Tower of Babel. So he's overtly connected to the Tower of Babel. But the important thing about the Tower of Babel biblically is it's not just a story. It is in many ways the story of the antithesis to God's kingdom, right? So you've got Babel you can translate it Babel or you can translate it Babylon. It doesn't matter, right? It's the exact same Hebrew word. So you have that story of the Tower of Babel. And then you have this motif or this theme that runs through the whole Old Testament, that there's this earthly power that's opposed to God, and it's described as Babylon. So Babylon it's the archetype by which Egypt and even the Philistines, like all of these pagan nations, are underneath Babylon. And then when you get to like Daniel or Isaiah and some of these prophets, or Jeremiah, I think is a big one, they always talk about Babylon, coming back to oppose God. And then you get to the book of Revelation, right? So you've got this kind of very forward-looking into kind of our time, anything post-resurrection. And what's the main enemy that rears its head again? And it's Babylon.
Right.
And that is, I mean, that's what pagan is, right? That's paganism is Babylon.
Yes.
And therefore, any return to pagan America is going to bring you right back to this theme of what does Babylon do? It tries to use technology in order to climb that ladder to God. And as you said, in order to usurp God and make God serve man. Well, where do we hear that? We heard that back in Genesis 3, right? With the serpent and with Satan. So this is the battle plan.
I mean, wasn't it Babylon that was described as like falling like a star from the heavens,
Yes.
right? You know, like O king of Babylon, you fell,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not just that Babylon is paganism, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the devil,
Right? Yeah,
you know,
that's the devil's behind paganism. That is
yes.
the Lord of paganism.
Yes, and that's why I say I said in our previous episode that paganism never goes away.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's always there. It can be defeated, it can be cast down, but it always is there, simmering below the surface. And where Christianity retreats, it bubbles back up again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's bubbling back up again in our time. It's not going to look like paganism of Carthage, or the paganism of 19th century Africa, you know, or the paganism of the Assyrians or the Canaanites. It's going to look like the paganism of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the forms it's going to take, I believe, is in artificial intelligence.
Another interesting thing you mentioned, kind of that you quoted it well, right? The Babylon, that falling star.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing, I think that's right. It might be right there, like in the next verse, or I think it's right in that point. But Lucifer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that term Lucifer, which we use for Satan, but Lucifer literally just means light,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they always connected that with the morning star. So it's the last star in that kind of stuck out in the morning, right? So
Mm-hmm.
all the stars disappear as the sun comes up, but the very last star that was Lucifer for the Babylonians,
Mm-hmm.
the actual nation of Babylon,
Mm-hmm.
right, where you have Nebuchadnezzar and such. And their idea with that was the last kind of part of night that stuck its finger up to
Mm-hmm.
God, right? So and
that rebelled against the dawn.
yeah, that rebelled against the dawn. And there's also this other aspect of it, that it was beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't just highlight this because it stuck against God,
Yeah.
but because it was a beauty,
Right.
right? So anything that is evil is going to, at first look, it's not going to look like Loab, right? Like that's
Sure.
kind of like your quote of, in the morning, this sounds really nice, and then in the evening, it's really dark.
Yeah,
so eventually you get to this picture of Loab, but at the beginning, it looks like, oh, this AI that can like solve all of our problems.
And this was the, you know, just to circle back to kind of where we started, this was the genius of Tolkien's creation story at the beginning of the Silmarillion, you know, which is, you know, one of the greatest passages in English language that I know, you know, for my money, it's one of the greatest, is the creation story of Middle Earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where Iluvatar, you know, calls the children of the Ainur together and propounds to them the great theme of music, right? And they all have their parts assigned, and they embark upon this great choral theme. And Melkor is chief among the Valar, right? He's the chief. He's the most powerful archangel, and he has the most prominent part in this music, and the most beautiful part, you know. And he has the greatest skill as well, and it is. But he becomes anxious both for his role to be more prominent, and he. As Tolkien writes very cryptically, he becomes anxious of the void, and he travels alone into the waste spaces by himself, and his mind became corrupted in the void, contemplating its emptiness. It says, Tolkien said, he became anxious of its emptiness, right? And so Melkor introduced discord into the theme of Iluvatar, and it caused chaos and distress to all the Valar around him. And when the theme of Iluvatar seemed like it was going to collapse into discord and incomprehension, Iluvatar used that discord, and he spoke into it a new theme that incorporated the dissonance and propounded something even more beautiful. And this continued, and you know, and this contest between Melkor and Iluvatar continued, with the theme building and building and building until at one point Iluvatar stands up and spreads his hands, and the music stops. And when the music stops, Iluvatar says, "Behold the work of your hands," and it's Middle Earth. And they have created with Iluvatar together. They have created Middle Earth, and the story goes on from there, right? But the point being, Melkor was the chief archangel. He was the most powerful. He had the most skill. He had the most intelligence, and it was he was not an ugly creature. He was a powerful and beautiful creature, and he fell. like the morning star, and he believed that Middle Earth belonged to him, and that it was his destiny and his right to rule over it and to bring order to it. And that was the source of his rebellion, and the source of all the stories that came from Tolkien after that. But it's a beautiful passage. It's obviously, 100% Christian.
Yes.
It's a Christian creation story for Middle Earth. But to your point, it's it's this notion that the morning star doesn't begin as a monster. It begins as a beautiful light in the sky, but a light raised up in rebellion against God. And we know how the story ends.